As I say, not everyone's on that page. You know, there are people who are sometimes sceptical about what's trying to be achieved here in Glasgow, and indeed about the whole climate change strategy being pursued by most governments around the world. And we're always here to reflect different views on GB News. So delighted to say we're joined by Alex Epstein, who is joining us from California. Good afternoon to you, Alex, or I should say good morning to you. Just set out where you are and what your impressions are of what's going on here in Glasgow.
Well, I think the previous guest you had, I think, reflects the religious delusion that's going on, because he says he's certain that we're headed toward disaster. He portrays today's world as uniquely bad, as endangered by climate. And the fact is, the world has never been better, including we've never been safer from climate. We're over 98. We have our rate of climate related deaths, so storms, floods, heat, etc., is down 98% over the last century. And one of the big reasons is that we burn fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are what power all the amazing machines that make our lives good. We still have 3 billion people in the world who still use less electricity than the average American refrigerator. So if you look at the facts, what we should be doing is expanding access to energy, including expanding the use of fossil fuels as well as nuclear. And instead, what we have is people acting like today's world is terrible and completely ignoring the people for whom it is terrible. That is, the people who are poor, specifically energy poor. So I think all of this is completely backwards.
Alex, does that include people who die from pollution? Because I don't surely they're included in your figures of natural disasters.
Well, no. So climate. So this is not a pollution conference, right? This is saying that everyone is going to die from climate. But if you want to factor in pollution, life expectancies using fossil fuels. You look at places like China and India, which have far worse pollution than we do. They have skyrocketing life expectancies. Why? Because the benefits of fossil fuels far, far outweigh the negative side effects. And that is the thing that the whole UN IPCC is in total denial of.
Life expectancy, that's news to me, it must be said. Also, isn't it a very human-centric view to be put in place? We share this planet.
Yes.
With millions of different species of animals. They've not had a great time, must be said, in the post-industrial era.
Well, that's an interesting part of this anti-human religion, is it's assumed that A, it's immoral for us to impact things, but also that it's worse for everything else. Actually, if we use dense sources of energy like fossil fuels and especially nuclear, we have a much better ability to preserve the best parts of nature. Whereas if we rely on biomass, as much of Europe is doing to hit its renewables targets, or we build a whole bunch of solar and wind, it actually makes it harder to preserve nature. So we can preserve the best parts of nature, but it is for humans. I don't want to save the planet from human beings. I want to improve the planet for human beings.
Alex, how important is it? Because, you know, clearly there will be people who agree with this view, and you're right to say there's a consensus certainly within this conference centre that it's not necessarily found universally across the world. And there's been talk, hasn't there, amongst social media companies to a degree about them ensuring that they would say the facts are on the ground, but the concern about freedom of rights and speech activists is that might curtail some of the sceptical voices. How concerned are you about the role that social media might play in this ongoing discussion?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that these platforms, I do believe these platforms own the platform, so they can do what they want in terms of what is, as long as they follow their own terms of service. In terms of what's rational, I think the key thing that all of them are getting wrong, which I mentioned before, is they're only looking at negative side effects of fossil fuels and not looking at benefits. So if you look at what Twitter is saying, they're like, oh, we're going to police all this climate misinformation, but they don't police the whole denial of the fact that climate-related deaths are at all-time lows, the fact that fossil fuels have driven world poverty, extreme poverty, from 40% to 10%, in the last 40 years. So they're totally evading the big picture. And also they're not very good on science. I have corrected social media platforms multiple times. A few months ago, I corrected Twitter. They admitted it. They corrected their story, but they didn't know something as simple as the fact that when we talk about 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, that's not from now. That's from 100 years ago. They didn't even know that, which shows how little they know about science. And so given that, they probably shouldn't be in the business of trying to fact check anyone. And if they do, they should really hire me.
You say that, Alex, though, but in the end, Lord Demnon was just on saying that almost every scientist in the world is on the same page as him. They're not on the same page as you.
No, I mean, that guy is a total fraud. If you look at what he said, his characterization of every scientist saying that we're headed for disaster is demonstrably false. What he's doing is he's taking the fact that there's consensus that we have some impact on climate and equating that with consensus on climate catastrophe. So that is a total equivocation. That's a basic fallacy in philosophy. And I don't know that guy. I've just studied him a little bit, but he is a charlatan, even just doing that, or he's totally ignorant of the actual science.
But why do you think you're so why do you think you're so right, and so many other people? It seems like actually probably the vast majority of people, at least in the science world, disagree with you. Why do you think you're right?
Well, first of all, I don't think you have a clear idea of what most people in science think, since that's all filtered through different institutions. But the basic reason I'm right and they're wrong is I think of things from a consistently pro-human perspective. So I look at the world in terms of I want to maximize human flourishing, and I look carefully at the full context, both the benefits and side effects of different options. Most people look at the world, or most people in the media look at the world from the perspective that human impact is evil, that we should eliminate it at all costs, and they only look for negative side effects of fossil fuels. That's how they can be totally ignorant of the fact that fossil fuels have made the world amazing. If you don't admit that today's world is amazing because of fossil fuels, you are totally unqualified to make any predictions about the future, because either you are anti-human or ignorant.
Okay, and just very finally, Alex, I mean, what is your solution to all of this? Is it a kind of laissez-faire, we don't really need to do anything, or is there any sense that actually we do need to mitigate some of this? Because I think, as you recognise yourself, humans do have an impact on the climate. It's just about how great that impact is.
Well, the fact that we have an impact doesn't even mean that it's net negative. I think the jury is out, because there's a lot of beneficial warming, and then greening is good. But I think my main focus is, I think the core problem in the world is poverty and lack of energy. So we should be optimizing for that. Now, part of that is actually liberating nuclear and other promising forms of non-carbon energy. But if you look at what that climate change organization that guy is part of, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, they're all about mandating unreliables, so solar and wind. Britain, historically, and the US have huge hostility toward nuclear. So we're not even doing a good job in terms of non-carbon. So I'm in favor of liberating everything, primarily to empower the world, but it will also make possible lower carbon real options in the future, instead of these total fantasy net zero things that will totally bankrupt Britain, even if you try to do 1/4 of it.
Okay, sorry, Alex, I was going to end it there. Just finally on that,
okay,
because that's a really important point you've just made. And that was, Boris Johnson's argument against that is that the UK has managed to cut its carbon emissions by 44% in the last 3 decades, yet GDP is up 78%. Arnold Schwarzenegger argues that California's got some of the most stringent environmental regulations and rules in the US, and yet it's by far still the strongest economy in the United States. Their argument is actually, this doesn't destroy economies, it helps them, this investment.
Yeah, I mean, so I know California very intimately since I live here. So first of all, what has been done so far is a tiny fraction of what's being advocated. And there's certain kinds of low-hanging fruit, like going from coal to gas. That's totally different than going from gas to unreliables, which nobody has done at scale in the world. Also, what's happening in California and the UK is we have huge problems with energy costs in California and in the UK. You have huge fuel poverty problems there, people literally freezing to death, burning old library books. So in terms of energy, it's a disaster. Yes, there are other things in your economy that are good, but you should be ashamed of the fact that you're not growing more, not proud of the fact that you managed to grow despite having an idiotic energy policy.
Okay, Alex Epstein, thank you very much indeed for joining us there from California. As I say, I'm not entirely sure lots of people would recognise a booming life expectancy rate in Russia and people freezing to death here in Britain. But do let me know your views, gbviews at gbnews.uk, or indeed at gbnews. Always keen to hear what you think of what we're saying here in Glasgow, and indeed the people that we interview on this programme, to get a sense of your thoughts.